It's an election year, and in an election year, one expects all kinds of strange things to happen. But before I talk about the strange things we expect to happen in this election year, let's just think of a couple of themes in the lead up to this election year. So it's not a surprise, and it wouldn't be a surprise, that the matric results at the end of 2018 were largely punted as really good. And I wonder why that would have been the case. You also had strange policy pronouncements on the eve of the ANC's election conference in 2017. No fees for everyone who comes from a family who earns less than 350,000 rand per annum. And yet today, we hear that the universities are in a bit of turmoil. You have policy or intended policy, such as land expropriation without compensation. You suddenly have an act which regulates the private funding of political parties. So those are some of the policy things which happened in the lead up to this year. But what are the challenges then? Well, the first and most basic one is the stabilization of state-owned enterprises, many of which are facing unsustainable debt, in some cases almost unrehabilitatable. And what people refuse to think about is the fact that perhaps there's certain incentives to ask other people to intervene in solving some of these problems. So, for example, appealing to the IMF. And that appeal would not just simply have a financial impact, but it literally, in an environment of fragmentation and factionalism within the governing party, means that the leader outsources the responsibility he or she needs to take, or collective responsibility as they like to call it, and outsource it somewhere else where you're unable to drive change and reform within the party. Second, you've got multiple and simultaneous commissions of inquiry. So what are the grand themes that we've got to face in this period coming up? And there are 5 of them which I want to outline. I'm going to group them together. The first is obviously we require a period of stabilization, recovery, growth, and then addressing the questions of inequality and race. So that's the first package of themes. The second is the question of service delivery. The third is the question of institutions, organizations, rights, bureaucratic rationality, the question of hierarchy, freedom and equality. The fourth is the theme of accountability, oversight, and responsiveness. And this has been a major failure over the last almost quarter century. And lastly, tied to that theme is the question of ethics, morality, and integrity. For which party is 2019 the year in which it spells the end? But let's just take each of the major parties in turn and see what we're faced with. And let's take the main governing party. They like to call themselves a ruling party, but in a democracy, no one rules. You govern for a specific period. So what's the problems? Well, I've hinted at the one. The most obvious one is that it's deeply fragmented, and there's deep levels of factionalism, and these are not ideological factions. Many of them are pure, private, narrow, interest-based factions around financial and other interests. Now, what does that mean for us as society if it remains the governing party? But given the 5 themes I've outlined, my argument is that we're faced with a moment of crucible. And it's a moment of crucible because we could either go the way of rehabilitation, or we could go the path of many societies to the north of our border. And what are they characterized by? Instability, fragmentation, low growth, high levels of unemployment, hollowed out institutions, and huge levels of informality. And when informality starts to take root in society, it literally renders institutions useless. But let's dispense with the few canards that we hear repeatedly when we talk about the future of South Africa. And you've heard the leader of the opposition yesterday saying or repeating for the fourth or the fifth time that coalitions are the future. Well, who said so? Until voters tell you that coalitions are what they want, you should take with a pinch of salt everything that a politician says. So that's the first canard that we should dispense with. Coalitions are the future. They may be the future depending on your preference. The second canard is that in this province in which we sit, Gauteng, the ANC is likely to lose. Well, we don't know. An election hasn't happened yet. The third canard is that voters are suddenly going to return to the ANC in droves because of Tumamina. The fourth canard is that people say the DA is dead. And they say this in every election. And yet in every election, the DA does at least 2.5% better than it did in the election before. But what can we say about all of the parties that we're faced with as a choice? Well, the first is that all parties are in a bit of a mess. The ANC, as explained, is already fragmented, is deeply factionalized, ideologically incoherent, has no real idea of what its future governance trajectory should look like, and so that's the first set of problems. The second is that the main opposition party, the DA, is faced with a massive identity crisis. It veers between some kind of left, liberal, social democratic party, right through to lurching towards the idea that it is some right-wing supply-side type organization which simply punts supply-side solutions. It doesn't apply its own rules properly. It has weak leadership. No one knows where the center lies. And then you've got the third major party, which literally is a craven mimicry of colonial mentality, because their political trajectory is all about destabilization, undermine institutions, and institutions which are finely crafted, domesticated, and fit for purpose for a society like ours, because those institutions were indigenously developed. So you've got parties with major problems, and that's what the society is faced with. In addition to all of those massive themes that I've outlined, how would we expect any of these to try and start addressing the major public policy and political problems in society as a whole? Now, let's also not be blind to the fact that parties in South Africa have a few distinct features which they share in common. They appear to propose vastly different political solutions, but they in fact don't. So you might be able to group them ideologically. They might sometimes differ on minor issues or on arcane ideological doctrine, but largely they offer a fairly similar basket of things to society. Why? The first is because there's been a fundamental inability to read the nature and change in the social structure. So South Africa is currently faced what I would call with 4 distinct classes in society. And notice I'm not using the word race, even though race matters. The first is a hyper-cosmopolitan, globally connected set of political and social elites who live in the major metropolitan areas, who are connected to global circuits of power, influence, finance, and commerce. So you've got a super elite, which coexists, at least in the urban areas, with a well-organized working class, even though it's diminishing, even though its organizational muscle has declined over time because of the fractions in the union movement and so forth. So you've got this formerly highly organized working class coexisting with a super elite. The third is that there is still a working class, but largely in precarious employment. So because of subcontracting, the gig economy, outsourcing, and so forth, these people are not highly organized. They're fragmented in the way in which they're socially connected and networked to other people. They have relationships with their employer, but no horizontal relationships amongst themselves. And lastly, you're faced with the precarious, what I call the precarious proletariat. These people are highly dependent on social grants, they're dependent on welfare transfers, they're dependent on transfers and remittances of people in their families who are employed, largely existing in informal settlements in the peripheries of the urban metropolitan townships because of apartheid spatial planning. So those are the four classes which exist. And I think no political party has been able to craft a policy and political agenda, either in terms of what their own offerings are in terms of a campaign, or in terms of what public policy ought to do in order to alleviate the problems of these people. The second is that there's been an inability to read what the demographic shifts in society are. And there have been certainly some fairly fundamental shifts in the demography of society. So younger people are now a larger part of the population, yet much of our public policy does not account for what their needs and requirements in fact are, and therefore it's no surprise that their approach and confidence levels and trust in public institutions are at an all-time low. Because of the uncertainty, parties are able to appeal or craft appeals to what they would consider the lowest common denominator in society. And they do so because they believe that's the largest mass which is going to get them into power. Now, that's not irrational because parties are in the business of getting power. But does that serve a governance agenda or a public policy agenda in resolving some of the fundamental contradictions we face in society? And unfortunately, it is not. Is there hope? There is hope. But the hope does not lie, unfortunately, with those who are in public authority. I would argue that the hope may in fact lie in the private sphere. And in the private sphere, I mean civil society, and I mean all of you who are in business. Because unfortunately, insofar as I've painted a picture of politicians, of people in public authority who are unresponsive and who face a crisis of credibility, who've been unaccountable and unresponsive, unfortunately, business has displayed much of the same kind of behavior. Business over the last 25 years, quarter century, has been amongst the most unaccountable and unresponsive set of institutions and organizations in society. Is there something that can be done? There can be done. It can be done, but it's relatively unpopular. The first is that one has to accept the fact that it cannot be business as usual. So you cannot drive for higher profits over the next decade. It won't happen, not just because of the environment, it won't happen because levels of trust, societal trust in organizations of business is also declining. The good news for you is that it's higher, the ratings are higher than it is for politicians and political parties, but it's declining from the high levels that it had a decade ago. So what can be done? The first is to moderate shareholder expectations around what kind of dividends can be paid and so forth. The second is to moderate executive pay. And so what can be done with some of the things which are saved here? The first is to cross-subsidize lower entry-level jobs. In those entry-level jobs, of course, people would say that the fourth industrial revolution is here, you can't afford that, we will mechanize, we will go the way of robotics, we will do all those kinds of things. So in the short run, those kind of unskilled, low-skill, entry-level, menial, routine-type jobs are going to have to be a necessary feature if we're going to address the question of inequality and address the question of those people who are left out of the formal market. It would be nice if we can rehabilitate the political terrain, but unfortunately, given the fragmentation, the factionalism, the problematization, the deep levels of not just competition, but now conflict amongst parties, means that the hope for that happening in the next 4 or 5 years is, in my view, fairly limited. I think we're at a moment if we don't make the interventions in the private realm and expect only these to be made in public authority, we're going to have a large swathe of society telling the rest of us, tu lawena, which means shut up you, rather than tu mamina, which means send me. So if we don't address this, then the nexus between politics, governance, and economy is going to break down and fracture further than the way it already has. I know I haven't spoken about corruption, I know I haven't spoken about state capture, but I suppose we can leave that chair for the panel discussion, because those are part of the problems of the major themes that are outlined at the beginning. Thank you very much.